The African continent has an extensive history of architecture. African architecture is one of the most diverse on the planet, and it contains some of the oldest forms in human history. You can find just about any architectural style imaginable. Unfortunately, popular historical narratives tend to ignore certain aspects of African architecture they don't understand or simply view as less than. But today, some scholars are beginning to reassess their ideas of architecture in general and acknowledge the limits of a Western outlook. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and contributing to this content. On Patreon, you can find more in-depth courses on African history. The link to Patreon is in the description box below. This video will only be scratching the surface on this topic because there is still so much to learn about traditional African architecture. We'll be focusing on the architecture below the Sahara, as the Western world seems to misunderstand and undervalue its purpose and ingenuity. In the Western world, we tend to only appreciate certain aspects of a civilization that reflects a more Eurocentric disposition. Because of this, usually African architecture below the Sahara doesn't get much attention. Until quite recently, the Western world accorded no place in its architectural schema to Africa, with the exception of Egypt. The subject of African architecture was, and indeed still is among many, not considered worthy of recognition. African architecture below the Sahara usually gets dismissed and even weaponized with certain demeaning terms. There's been a rather stagnant definition of architecture from a Western standpoint. Traditionally, the Western world viewed architecture in terms of permanent, monumental public structures which could be documented in time and space. Sometimes, African architecture didn't fit that mold. We'll get into those reasons a little later. A more recent understanding of architecture reflects a broader framework of man-built environments with a focus on man's relationship with the world around him. Looking at a permanent monumental structure cannot be the primary defining factor, but analyzing how a structure works best in a given environment expands the depth of how we define and recognize architecture. According to LaBelle-Presson, Western paradigms about architecture have imposed on us narrow boundaries. We've inherited this limited Western ideology through comments made by European visitors who mostly saw the African coastlines. Most European visitors were not afforded the opportunity to go further inland, either through choice, disease, or other restrictions. So their first impression of coastline African architecture permeated the narrative, aside from the fact that they truly did not understand what they were seeing. According to Dr. LaBelle, the climate of the humid coastal rainforest belt, where there is little temperature change between day and night, or even between wet and dry seasons, calls for a shelter with a maximum of cross ventilation to ensure bodily comfort. To achieve such a design, the indigenous coastal builder will strive to incorporate some variant of louvered or natural opening into the house he builds. Bamboo walls simulating openwork screens are designed to encourage air circulation. Floors are often raised high off the ground on platforms to catch the ocean breezes. The traditional rectangular building form found in the rainforest is, by virtue of its easy adaptation to a cardinal orientation, more suited for the exploitation of cross breezes. This level of ingenuity is often not cited or valued in popular culture. The sophistication of African architecture, even along the coastal regions, points to a level of expertise and knowledge that has been grossly underappreciated, even to the point of being weaponized with various degrading titles as mentioned before. This tradition certainly began with European eyewitness accounts. The irony here is that European colonial settlements along the African coast literally began mimicking traditional African architecture because they began to understand the brilliance behind it. Early British and French colonial settlers and administrators recognizing the merit of indigenous solutions to climatic comfort, emulated them by raising their expatriate mansions high above the ground and by developing a wall system composed of louvered doors and screened verandas. Many examples can still be seen in Abidjan, Accra, Lagos, and Dakar. Unfortunately, this has been an historical pandemic far too familiar to the African diaspora. The denigration of African ingenuity, creativity, and even physique, followed by the unabashed mimicking of it. African architectural ingenuity reaches throughout all corners of Africa below the Sahara. In the Savannah region, the climate requires an architectural solution that can cut winds while simultaneously establish cool relief from the intense heat of the midday sun. According to Labelle Prussin, the African earthen roundhouse with its insulating walls can accumulate and store the heat of the day for evening comfort. Moreover, the circular form, in contrast to the rectangular, helps to concentrate thermal radiation in a central enclosed interior space. Rather than strive for maximum ventilation, the Savannah builder will shun window openings and limit the single door opening to the smallest possible dimension, so that the thermal properties offered by the thick earthen walls will be maximized. Not only is earthen construction more suited to the demands of climate, but the drier climate itself permits the use of earthen materials without supporting structural reinforcement. Given this perspective, it's hard to justify the belittling of the often called mud hut architectural styles. It's important that we acknowledge and understand its rightful place in the greater narrative of human architectural history. As mentioned before, traditionally the Western world viewed architecture in terms of permanent, monumental public structures, which could be documented in time and space. This definition of architecture did not holistically fit into an African mold. This is primarily due to the idea of permanency. The idea of architectural permanence was principal in defining and identifying Western ideas of architecture. The African concept of architecture completely turns this paradigm on its head and has sparked conversations about how we should define architecture itself. As Labelle points out, except for a few stone ruins from a number of medieval cities on the continent, there is little evidence for an African architecture in permanent materials. The concept of permanence perhaps only existed as a structural marking point for an ancestral place of origin. Case in point, among the Abure people of the Ivory Coast, entire villages moved every generation in order to make room for the deceased ancestors who also need a place to live. Non-permanence, however, does not presuppose the absence of a stable system of place. Rather, it connotes renewal, rejuvenation, and rebirth. In general, African architectural ideology seems to encourage a working relationship with nature instead of a relationship centered on taming or conquering it. These small details concerning the African philosophy of place and architecture, though small on the surface, remain critical concepts in understanding African architecture. Any observation devoid of this African context is what leads to the abandonment of its inclusion. And we have seen this clearly in how the Western world treats African architecture below the Sahara. The concepts of center, boundary, path, direction, area, and domain are not unique to Africa. They exist equally as well in highly sophisticated, technologically advanced societies. What is unique to Africa are the ways in which these concepts manifest themselves. An understanding of those manifestations will in turn provide us with innumerable insights into what is already on the horizon, a truly universal theory of architecture which can embrace the whole of our man-built environment.